Welcome back to Bold TV. I'm Philip Michael. Now, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, they're all billionaire founders who put themselves out there in the media and created sort of a brand by being themselves outside of their company. But is that a good thing or a bad thing? Here to talk about this is branding expert and consultant Liz Goldgood.
Hey there, nice to be here.
Hi, Liz. Now, when does a CEO become a brand? Like Jeff Bezos is in the news sometimes, but people don't know that much about him. When does that switch flip?
A CEO becomes a brand when they morph from being faceless to unforgettable.
How does that happen?
Well, if we look at a case, let's say, of Richard Branson. Richard Branson is so compelling because he does these crazy publicity stunts.
Such as?
And as a result, he dressed up as a bride, for example, to announce the opening of a new Virgin Bridal store. He jumped off one of the casinos in Las Vegas to announce his arrival. He rode on a horse. He does these incredible things that the brand and Richard are indelibly linked.
Interesting. So, again, is that sort of the formula? What about a guy like Elon Musk? How does that he's now, for all intents and purposes, a social media troll. How did he become that big in the first place where he has his massive following and people follow him even if they don't understand his business model? Or even if he isn't that, if he isn't that particularly, well, I suppose he is entertaining, but is totally separated from this business. How did that happen?
Well, it started because he did have a great product, right, which was the Tesla. And then it morphed, and he's now become to the point where if Elon talks, people listen. So as you know, he can control the price of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right? And you also know he's a brand because people were angry that he was going to go on Saturday Night Live, even its own cast members. So it brings up this really key point about branding, and that is, if you are a brand, people love you or hate you, or you're not a brand. If you are faceless, if you're not memorable, you have committed genericide.
Genericide?
Genericide. No one wants to be generic, right? Great brands are consistent, compelling, differentiated, and unforgettable.
Here's one of the things. You bring forth an interesting point because probably one of the first CEOs to become a public brand is the 45th president who came, because his father was a real estate developer. He was a real estate developer too, but got out in the public, in the public's eyes and into the public's imagination, became a part of pop culture. One of the things with the leading up to the presidential election was picking a side, almost being loved or hated because then people care. You can't be generic. Is that an example of that, just picking a side? And is that necessary to do that, to have quote unquote haters on one side and supporters on the other? Is that necessary in order to become that brand?
It's 100% necessary. If you were trying to please everybody, you please nobody.
Interesting.
So it's really important that you recognize who your consumers are and who they're not. I mean, we know, for example, that Nike went out on a limb when it did all of their work with Colin Kaepernick.
Yes.
Right? People loved it or they hated it.
Right.
We would call that good branding. But don't forget that consumers have the power to fight with their feet and their wallets. Right? So when we saw, for example, the CEOs of both MyPillow and Goya, what they were doing is aligning themselves so closely with Trump that there was a backlash. Immediately after the Capitol riots, we saw that Kohl's, Bed Bath & Beyond, and Wayfair all dropped distribution of MyPillow because they said, we don't want to be associated with it. They picked a side and they paid a price.
So understanding those possible pitfalls, how do you do it right? What's a good example that you've seen where someone picks a side and becomes a brand, and without all the extra stuff that comes with it? What is one of the things that you've seen from your standpoint that actually worked, and it could be a template for others to follow?
Right. I think, for example, if you go way back, now they're owned by Unilever, but I think Ben & Jerry's was one of the first ones who embraced social causes.
Okay.
They're the ones who were talking about equality. They were talking about the environment. They were talking about giving back before it was such a common business model, right? Like Tom's or Warby Parker, buy one, give one. So I think those tenets have held true for them, but they've been consistent. The thing to remember about brands is that consistency. You can't flip-flop and be one thing today and a different thing tomorrow. Great brands build upon that expectation. So if you're really trying to build both a personal brand and a corporate brand, You really are centered around consistency, differentiated, and compelling. And if you work on those three principles, you turn into that brand that has flawless recall.
You mentioned flawless recall. What happens when a CEO becomes so much bigger than the company? For instance, with Bill Gates' alleged affairs. Do they influence the Microsoft brand? Jeff Bezos had a situation as well. Do they influence the brand, or do people just sort of just accept, you know what, that's his personal life? What do you see there, again, from your side of the table?
I don't believe that we as consumers or as viewers think that there's a line any longer between our personal life and professional life, right? Thanks to social media, we can all take a deep dive. So what we do in public and what we do in private, unfortunately, have really been immersed and meshed together. So I believe, and some of these brands have become so huge that these CEOs, even if they're no longer at the helm, even if they're deceased, we still think that they're part of the brand. I think most people still say Apple and think of Steve Jobs.
Correct. Right?
Bill Gates, they still are thinking, right? Microsoft, even though he stepped down, even as the chairman last year. So Lee Iacocca, Chrysler would be another example. These are such unforgettable brands that even if they're no longer active, we associate them with the product. And in one sense, that's a good thing. On the other hand, it's sort of a bad thing because that leaves someone like a Tim Cook trying to figure out, how do I replace someone like Steve Jobs?
Right, because this is a guy that's a very public figure, very, you can say, if not A-list celebrity, then definitely the tier right below. But pretty much everybody knows Steve Jobs. He passed away, again, as you mentioned, is Tim Cook now, but the Apple brand doesn't seem to have diminished. And they're worth more now than they ever were before, again, for, as they get more market share, inflation and whatnot, but they're worth more now than they ever were before. Is this a situation where they become associated with a big CEO, and even though, like you mentioned, he steps down, the brand can thrive even after the guy eventually passes away or steps down or whatever the case is. Is this sustainable for companies? Is it a liability if they're too closely tied to a founder? That was a big name.
Well, I think if you look at the Apple case, the big legacy that Tim Cook kept on was innovation. So we remember that Steve Jobs was always doing these huge Apple events. And remember, he was taking the iPhone out of his pocket, right? And he had these big secrets, but it was all based upon innovation. And Tim Cook has continued to do that. Also interesting to note is that every time they're one of these big shows for Apple, Steve showed up in that black mock turtleneck.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Goes to prove our point about branding, which is if you can't be imitated, you are not a brand.
Interesting. That is such an interesting point. Now, wow, that made me speechless for a second. If you cannot be imitated, then you're not a brand. Now, who do you see on the horizon that could be the next public CEO? That's not currently in the public in the pop culture conversation, but what will be in the future. Based on what you've seen before, Elon Musk emerged, so on and so forth. Who's the next one?
I don't know. I think Jack Dorsey of Twitter and Square is really very interesting, and he also becomes compelling because he has some really crazy rituals, right? He talks about his ice baths, for example. He talks about his fasting. He has some peculiarities which make him interesting. At the same time, he has really become on the forefront of social media, right? And Trump and Twitter became, on one hand, very good friends. Everything Trump did, that became his mega mouthpiece.
Of course.
So Twitter became very, very important. And as a result, so did Jack Dorsey. Great brands, we have to care. They pull our heartstrings and then they pull our purse strings.
The heartstrings followed by the purse strings. All right. That's a mantra to keep in mind when you're out there shopping. Did someone pull your heartstrings before your purse strings got pulled up? Thank you so much for being here today, Liz.
It's always great. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Make sure to follow Bold TV on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Have a great day. I'm Philip Michael, and I'm out of here. Peace.